I'm Kazis Varnelis, and I'm a fellow in the Annenberg Center for Communications Networked Publics Group this year. On behalf of all of us here, I'd like to welcome you to this talk by Geoffrey Bowker. He is the Executive Director and Regis and Diane McKenna Chair in the Center for Science, Technology, and Society at Santa Clara University. His books include Science on the Run, Information Management and Industrial Geophysics at Schlumberger, 1920 to 1940, and Sorting Things Out, Classification and Its Consequences, co-authored with Susan Leigh Starr. Today's lecture draws on material from his forthcoming book, Memory Practices in the Sciences, in which he will discuss how over the last 200 years, scientists have thought of the past. You have your book here somewhere. It's the one copy that apparently exists at the moment, at least in this particular continent.
Yeah, it should be coming out this week.
Yeah. I was threatening not to give it back to him, so I was thinking maybe somebody else pickpocketed him. Look, so here it is, this great-looking new tome. I'm very much looking forward to it. In this book, he's going to look at how three dominant sciences of their time, geology in the 1830s, cybernetics in the 1950s, and biodiversity science today, all looked at history. And he promises us, however, that today's talk actually won't really deal with that book. So you will then be, your appetite will be whetted and you'll want to go out and read more. So that's really all I want to say. I don't want to keep this long. Just as a, just say as a historian, we weren't expecting you were going to talk about history. We thought you were going to be talking about classification and forms of organization. And so as a historian, I'm particularly delighted that you come and talk to us about history, which, the internet is now something I've been on for 16, 17 years. And it's beginning to, it's thickening. It's getting more and more back to it. And at the same time, it's also enabling various new kinds of practices involving history. And so it's, I think, a very, very key and important thing to come and talk to us about. Okay.
Thank you. Well, I do hate it when the introduction is better than the talk, but I'll do my best. Okay, I'm going to slide over several grams today, so let me give you a little bit of structure to what I'll be doing before I go into it. I'm going to look at what and how we remember with the new information technologies we have today. I'm then going to do a riff on the virtues and values and nature of forgetting in today's culture, and I'm then going to finalize with various kinds of alternative remembering, other kinds of memory practices. I'm going to kick off with two texts and a picture, and I'll finish with the same two texts and a different picture. The first one's from the Mahabharata. It's a wonderful long way of saying what L.P. Hartley said in a single sentence: the past is a different country, they do things differently there. And this is, Vasampayana said, "The splendid monkey began to laugh and said, 'Neither you nor anyone can see that form, for that was in another age that is no more. Time is different in the eon of the winning throw, different in the tray and the juice. This is the age of deterioration, and I no longer possess that form. Earth, rivers, trees, mountains, siddhas, gods, and time from eon to eon, as do the creatures, for strength, size, and capacity decrease and rise again. Therefore enough of your seeing of that form, sign of Kuru's line. I too conform to the eon, for time is inescapable.'" And Bhima, who's one of the heroes of the Mahabharata, says, "Tell me the number of eons and the manner of each of them, the state therein of law, profit, and pleasure, of size, power, existence, and death." So I'm interested in, from that quote, and I'll come back to it as I say at the end, from that quote what I'm interested in is, are we dealing with a radically new world today? What are the kinds of continuities that there are with the past? And how are we creating different kinds of past out of the new information infrastructures that we build? And I'll turn to Thomas Pynchon, Mason and Dixon, one of the great comic novels of the 20th century, with my second lead-off quote, text. "Facts are but the playthings of lawyers, tops and hoops forever a spin. Alas, the historian may indulge no such idle rotating. History is no chronology, for that is left to lawyers, nor is it remembrance, for remembrance belongs to the people. History can as little pretend to the veracity of the one as claim the power of the other. Her practitioners, to survive, must soon learn the arts of the quidnunc, spy, and taproom wit. That there may ever continue more than one lifeline back into a past, we risk each day losing our fair bores in forever. Not a chain of single links, for one broken link could lose us all. Rather a great disorderly tangle of lines, long and short, weak and strong, vanishing into the mnemonic deep, with only their destination in common. And what I'm going to hold from this quote and kind of keep punching out a little bit during the talk today is this idea of keeping hold multiple strands back into the past and ways in which we can do that, and also ways in which this is not being done today. Finally, to get away from a little bit of the verbiage on screen, this is a cartoon from one of my favourite cartoonists, Lunig, an Australian cartoonist. And this is sort of a reminder to us that we can fix our eyes on the technology and be totally entranced by what's going on with the IT. Here it's the new technology of drawing and painting, and lose track of all that's going on in the world outside, what's accompanying the changes in information technology. So I'll also have that as an ongoing theme. So we have, with the new information technology, incredible new ways of representing the past and representing the way things happen at all kinds of different time scale and physical scale. This is a representation I pulled off of the Big Bang, one of the more unlikely events that astronomers tell us happened maybe sometime in the past. Here is bottom left is a forward motion of the creation of Gondwana. It's split into continents, and in the main screen we see it backwards, and that's how Gondwana land came together. You can see Laurasia at the top. Key events, obviously, in geological history. We can also see things at the very small level in cells. This is either mitosis or meiosis, I can never remember. I'm sure one of you in the audience will know. Or time-lapse photography. We can see this. This is the very rare flowering. I think there's been 10 flowerings in the West of the Titan amorphophallus, and I think you can see why it's called the amorphophallus, also known as the carrion plant. It sends out, it's the biggest flower in the world, and sends out a stink, which carrion bugs then go after. Along the way, what we're doing is, in a sense, databasing the world. I'm drawing myself partly here on Lev Manovich's wonderful observation that the database is a central symbolic form of our time. And I'm probably going to push it a bit further back in time than Lev and say really we're talking about the centrality of the database since about the late 18th century, and I'd certainly attach it to the same time period that Foucault talks about with governmentality, and I can go into a lot more details on that should the need arise later. But we can see the rise of statistics is clearly part of that. Statistics itself etymologically being the science of the state. This one, databasing the world, this is actually from a mental home in England where they barcode their patients. Also highly appropriate for academic discourse, laughing or talking to self 3 times in the past month, difficulty stopping if reminded, is probably my best descriptor, but I'm sure you can recognize yourself in there somewhere. We're also talking about barcoding nature right now. This is this is a headline ripped from the news, ripped from Science, muddled over your moths, just check the barcode. There's an idea now that we'll be able to actually recognize species by barcoding the genes. So we can just kind of scan a section of gene in, barcode, get the species back, and lots of species information. We're taking our information technology and pushing it out into nature, giving us new forms of interaction with the natural world. We're also saving information, saving genetic information in much the same way, in fact, as we save money. Thus the Genetic Savings and Clone Company, which is promising to, this is another new cat out of the bag, little Gizmo, our newest clone. The world in general is becoming informated, very heavily informated. This is one of the few areas on Earth where we've not penetrated with our information technology. Lake Vostok in the Siberian wilds is as large as any of the Great Lakes. It's been shut off for, I think it's 2 to 10 million years, I forget which. And we're just burrowing down to it right now. You can just see Vostok Station is getting down. I think they're within about 20 meters of it. The idea is that there might ultimately be a little section down there with hydrothermal vents which has a separable ecology. But there really is no separable ecology. There really is no separate part of nature that's out there in the world right now. We're increasingly measuring nature, barcoding it, analyzing it, representing it, and we've got enormous new skills to do that with. So what's memory got to do with all this? What kinds of stories are we telling about the past? How do we do it, and how should we understand that in the context of the new information technologies? Well, very few of us nowadays would believe that memory exists in the brain. It's, I think, very widely accepted, certainly within my field, although Mary Douglas has a wonderful quote about psychology where she says that the discipline of psychology discovers that memory is social once every 30 years and promptly forgets it. The reason she argues they forget it is that there's no room for it in the textbooks, and social memory, slower forms of memory, don't fit in with the experimental psychological tradition. So even though this might be recognized at various points, it's often forgotten. But I'm going to work from the basis of memory being social. But I'd like to just, well, we're dealing with the certainties and uncertainties of memory, because one of the things I'm going to be arguing for today is the value of holding different views of the past and different shapings of the past and ways in which we can do that. This is a cartoon by Gary Larson about flashbulb memory. I don't know if any of you know the concept of flashbulb memory. It's what were you doing when JFK was shot, which I can barely remember. More common one is what were you doing when John Lennon was killed. I'm not quite certain what the vision is today, but there's or what were you doing at the time of 9/11? I guess would be another one. And here we've got the various creatures responding to when Bambi's mother had been shot. I was getting ready to cross the interstate. I was down by the edge of the lake at the time. I was under a rock getting ready to shed. These are memories that we really hold as our most certain memories of the past. They're things that we're absolutely convinced this is what happened. Ulrich Neisser did a gorgeous study in the 1960s where he took, 1960s or 70s, where he took a series of flashbulb memories around the time of JFK's assassination and interviewed 80-odd people and then went back and checked their stories. In over 80% of the stories, he found inconsistencies. Cousins who were not there, who were said to be there, brothers who were actually already dead at the time, but you remembered them being in the kitchen, the new oven not being there, but you remember the new oven. All sorts of inconsistencies that fit into your most certain memories. We're very good at creating certainty in memory. We're not very good at creating, at recognizing the actual ways in which the past can change is different and is differently configured according to different kinds of memory practice. Now, one of the things that folks are saying about the internet is that it's unlike those old eras of the file cabinet, the hanging files, the file folder, that great invention of the late 19th century. And I think that Joanne Yates really did so much in Control Through Communication to really bring to the fore that really record keeping, carbon paper, typewriters, the wooden desk, the physical technology of office organization is really, really important, as well as the punch card technology, the computers, and the kind of high-tech, sexy things that we deal with today. But we get the idea today that somehow we're getting way beyond the file folder, way beyond the file cabinet. You can imagine in this set of file folders somewhere there's the Holy Grail being hidden. Are we getting to, this is Proust with his Madeleine. Is Proust able, one way or another, Proustian style of memory, recollection, is that able to give us different kind of accesses to the present, to the past? I'll come back to that a little bit later. So let's talk about the ways in which we are remembering now on the internet and the way in which we're organizing the past on the internet. One thing is, okay, 2 points I want to make about this slide. This was an attempt that Swatch put out several years ago. I don't know if you remember. It's still going, but I don't know very many people at all in the world who use it. Swatch time. So you wanted to communicate with people all over the world. So instead of having different time zones and all that good stuff, there's a single swatch time at any one time in the world. And your swatch watch, you used to be able to press a button. I don't even know if you can do that nowadays, which transported you into internet time. The new time unit was the dot beat. The @ sign in front recognizes the swatch time. 2 points about that. One is that when you introduce a new time series, it gets incredibly difficult in interesting ways to actually go back and reconcile the new times with the old times. Historians have that problem as we shift from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar in the 18th century. It's very difficult to work out exact times and dates as you go backwards in time. It's very difficult if you inaugurate a new time and a new form of timekeeping. It's very difficult to get access to previous records. We tend to go from this moment on in our record keeping. So internet time. Now I got interested in this, I know exactly when I got interested in it. Basically when it came out on the 3rd of March 1999, when I was living in Urbana-Champaign, and I wrote a letter to Richard John, my partner Lee Starr, and Joanne Yates at Sloan, saying, do you know about this new kind of international time? I also that day wrote a note to Andy Pickering, a colleague of mine in science studies, saying I wanted a graduate student. And I wrote a second one to Richard about internet time because he responds very quickly to messages, and Nick Baboulis actually always sends a lot of messages. What's key about this is that Derrida makes the point in Archive Fever that we now have access to a different kind of memory of our own personal past. This is all ephemera. There's no way in the world I would have been able to remember this, recall this in previous times, but I can more or less get that day, 3rd of March 1999, I can sort of think about see what I was thinking about at that stage. I can sort of relate to, well, who are my interlocutors? What else was I thinking about when I was thinking about Internet Standard Time? All of that good stuff. Actually, this is a sort of interface which the live streams program, which has been relatively unsuccessful, has tried to organize all of computer files in terms of the date at which they come in, so that you can always at any one stage find out what you were reading at the time when you were doing this and at the time when you were speaking with this person about X. So you can actually recreate the past, get access to the past in new sorts of ways. Derrida says that this actually changes. The interesting claim he makes, although typically Derridian he doesn't follow through, is that this changes our unconscious. It changes literally the kinds of people that we are, because we have this new kind of prosthetic memory that exists. That day, when I go to Google Desktop, I find that I have no emails, no emails because it doesn't pick up Eudora, 234 files and 33 of my web history, which cover exactly that date. That's on my computer, which carries my memory around with me. If I go out into the internet, I find that Oscar was the cat of the day, that there was volcanic activity in Italy, that a prize llama was born that day, and this is what my favourite garden in Maroochydore in Australia looked like on the 3rd of March 1999. Enormous access to that particular day and time is available to me, and that's what Mars looked like on the 3rd of March 1999 for your interest. Very easy to get that kind of information, this kind of total access to the past, and I'm going to problematize that in a minute, but let me rip through another few examples before I do. What we have now then is new ways of remembering, and people are taking advantage of these on a huge new scale. From eternal flame sites, for example, a lasting place of remembrance for all time, loved ones, friends, and family. And we go in there, we find out we can actually create our own memorials for a mere $10 for up to 75 words, with a thumbnail photo for $25. Individual monument page is $100. So you can create an eternal flame website, good as long as the operating system lasts, obviously. Memoriam.org is another one. It allows you to create free memorials for loved ones who have passed away. And on this site, you get enormously personal information, a kind of personal information that I wouldn't have been able to have access to many years ago. How would I have known about Zalfa Ali Ahmad and you know, her final hours and her beautiful spirit? But I now have a picture of her. I have some very personal recollections of her. And I have one of her favorite poems, a lovely poem by Pablo Neruda, written for her. We also have, with the internet, huge boom in scrapbooking. Scrapbooking is now a billion-dollar industry. Scrapbooking.com magazine provides loads and loads of alternatives for us to create our own pasts, to create our own narratives, to reproduce the past. Quick point about the Memoriam sites is, well, they're only as good as the latest infrastructure that they work on. This is one of the earliest Eternal Flame sites for Gordon Pask, one of the initial cyberneticians, who died in 1996. Interesting thing about that is it's also a marker of the state of the internet at that stage. Very few graphics, very simple links. So the flame is living on, but it's flickering in a very different color than the so-called eternal flames that are being built today. Eternal flames are eternal just up to a point. New technology, and there are folks in the room who know a lot more about this than I do, so I will slip over the slides. Nancy Van House is doing a lovely study right now of people's use of cameras in mobile phones, and the kinds of technologies there. It's a fairly boring series of photos that people are keeping there in some cases, but which actually allow you to scrapbook and keep all kinds of records about all kinds of objects, digital objects about your past. So let's talk for a minute about photography in the past. And I'm going to start problematizing now all of these various kinds of memory that I've been giving some paeans of praise to. This is a Canadian couple just before the tsunami hit. And the first photo is taken 2 days before they died. Second and third photos and the next screen are in a sequence where you can see the tidal wave just in the background there, and the fact that the water's gone away from the beach. Next one along, we see the waves starting to form on the horizon. Third one in, you see this massive wave coming up, and this poor figure in the foreground is about to be swept away. Fourth one, the tidal wave hits. Fifth one, those folks die. The camera is found several days later, floating in the water, and that's what's preserved. There's something really interesting going on there. There was a wonderful science fiction film a few years ago, which was about going to the center of the Earth because the core had stopped spinning. And there was someone who was on a rocket down there, and they were dictating into their notebook, even unto the very time when a nuclear explosion went off and blew them into smithereens. And it's Stanley Tucci doing this. And the final moment before he dies is he bursts out laughing and says, why the hell am I taking a record of this? Because it's about to explode on me. What is it about that act of photography, that act of archiving, that's so important? Now, Serge Tisserand, who's a French psychoanalyst, who's psychoanalyst of Tintin, the comic book artist, but also wrote a wonderful book about photography. And one of his points is that it doesn't matter that nobody goes back to these photos after, which in general they don't. Most films never get developed. Once they're developed, most photos don't ever get looked at. They certainly don't get albumed away. So when we analyze the act of archiving, when we analyze the act of taking the photograph, our attention should not be on the future record, because that's not what these things do. Our attention should be on the framing of the present. What work is this doing in the present, this archiving? So, general point there. Oh yeah, that's the rest of the scrapbook. Now, I went through the 3rd of March, 1999, and it was very easy to do. This is from from an artwork called 1 Million Years BC. This is one of the more interesting pages, which takes you from 498,500 to 398,501. It's a several volume series. What this reminds us is, in Eisenstein's words, that linear time, as we've come to know and love it, was largely a creation of the book and book culture. Galilean time, which then became so central in physics, largely came out of the way in which information was organized on the printed page. The linear storytelling that we're so familiar with, again, is a function to some extent of the printed page. This is the sort of point Levi-Strauss makes in his mythologies when he contrasts myth-telling with the rise of the novel. When we look at the internet and underlying all the apparent flexibility of the internet, we find a single chronological linear time again and again and again, underlying all of the structures. Making the same style of argument here as people made about hypertext. Hypertext seems to be giving you links in every direction all the time, but logically you can understand hypertext databases as being a simple hierarchical database. It starts from here, branches, 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 branches. Which brings me to the next slide, which is about the forms of organization on the internet and the forms of organization of the past. This is the standard tree of life from biology, the Homer Simpson version, which takes us from single one life forms to sponges, loofahs, Brillo pads, and sponges with scrubber surface backing. We all recognize this form of the tree of knowledge. It occurs in multiple disciplines simultaneously. And it's actually been problematized, although I won't go into this right now, it's been problematized in multiple disciplines simultaneously too. It's as problematic right now within biological science as it is within the critical sciences and within postmodern attacks on classification systems. But this form of tree form of organization of knowledge, the simple classification, the assumption that there's going to be a stable ontology, what's wrong with this picture? Well, several things are wrong with this picture. I'll give you one example. If you have already defined what your objects are in the world and you're pretty certain what the objects are that make up the world, you've got very little room for dealing with new objects when they come in. You've got very few ways of actually dealing with radical novelty in the world. Now, it's one thing scientists, academics, critical theorists do is they create new ontologies, new ways of understanding the world. But to a significant extent, we're trapped by our own information systems into repeating the old ways of thinking, repeating the old classifications, repeating the old knowledge hierarchies. Yeah, I can go into a lot more detail about that, but I won't. Okay, third point of difference, third point of difficulty with these forms of organization, which again seems so new and seems to be so much information out there, is you often do get points of discontinuity as you move on to the new medium. This is an example of a point of discontinuity moving on to the new medium, where you've got Australia has recently moved about 100 meters northeast. Highly problematic for dealing with lots of old maps, for dealing with lots of old representations of the world. We see at the basis of a lot of the organization of information on the web right now this kind of structure. This is the psych, ontology, and knowledge base. For those of you that don't know it, ontology has become something of a key word in computer science in recent years for folks trying to build cyber infrastructure or the new ways of organizing information for scientists and social scientists on the web. And the idea is, as far as psych's concerned, that we would get a single ontology, and this is one that goes from thing at the top right, at the very top of the pyramid, to what is it, intangible thing or individual, right down to Earth and solar system, everyday living, and business, military, and organizations. The idea is this would be a complete single stable ontology of the world. This is the dream of the semantic web. The real virtue of it is, in principle, what we'd be able to do is track information, from multiple different disciplines, from many different sources, reconcile different databases. We'd be able to have a worldwide access to knowledge, a world brain in H.G. Wells' term from the 1920s, in ways that were radically unthinkable in the past. Now, this kind of goal, the psych goal, which is closely associated with semantic web and semantic web thinking, and that's why I've associated it too with the Cyclops up there. This is very similar to encyclopedic visions which have been running since about the late 19th century. The idea that the world can be split into a simple ontology, single ontology, and that single unitary ontology can be used to describe things. Now, that's what I'm going to say is most problematic about the ways in which we continue to organize the past and we continue to think about the past on the web, because in fact what we need to be able to do is deal with multiple ontologies, multiple lines back into the past, multiple possible pasts and multiple possible past histories. So why should we do this? Well, let's start with going right back to a source, a huge classification source, Auguste Comte. Church of Positive Philosophy in the 1830s, 1840s, founder of the discipline of sociology, created the Church of Positive Philosophy, created, as did the radical revolutionaries at the time of the French Revolution, a new calendar. That new calendar, he said, would be a concrete cult of humanity, material cult of humanity. And these are the various months with instead of having saints, except we'd have St. Paul, still hangs in there, but basically Dante, Gutenberg, Shakespeare, Descartes, and Bichat, who I suspect many of you won't recognize. And we then go into a little bit more detail, because there's one more bit I wanted to pull out of that, which is if we look at his commemorative set, we have the famous scientists, and there we are, that's the last month, the 13th month, which is called Bichat, who is the anatomist, is the Bichat. Here are the instead of the saints' names, what we have are the scientists' names. And you'll recognize, of course, that many of these scientists are not very famous today. I could certainly run through most of them, but even a few of those I'm lost on. It's interesting that we have Gall gets Sunday the 28th, the very last day of the year. Gall, one of the founders of phrenology, forerunner of eugenics, person who was famously said that women's brains were smaller than men's brains on average, and that was why they were more stupid. They then opened up his brain on his death and found out that it was smaller than the average woman's brain. So a problem of consistency there. So there's that kind of commemoration. And that kind of commemoration is behind a lot of the ways in which we are creating memories and creating histories on the web. That somehow, at some future point, there will be someone who will have the time, some St. Peter at the pearly gate, who will have the time to go back and weigh our lives in the balance, will recognize the value that we have created, will recognize ourselves as monuments in the world. Now, that's one very specific kind of memory, and I think that's a failed and failing kind of memory, and that's the kind of memory where we look much more at what's the act in the present than what's the future. Now, a second kind of memory that's associated with Comte is, I think, a really interesting one, and associated with the ontology point I was making just before, and this is that he argued that we no longer need to know how scientific discoveries were made. There are just too many stories. There are too many different paths that were taken. It's too complex. Nobody can or should remember all of the false paths that were taken. What we need to create, he said, is what later came to be called a rational reconstruction of the past. How it would have been had we been acting rationally. Now that, he said, we can recall. The way in which we can recall it, the tool that we'll use to recall it, is our classification systems. And he came out with a new classification system for science. And often classification is itself a form of memory and memory practice. Thus, for example, the reason that there are as many genera as there are genuses in the world in the Linnaean system of botanical classification is because Linnaeus said, I need basically enough genera in the world that the field biologist can remember them when they go out into the field. It was nothing to do with the actual entities that carved up the world. You carve up the world in such a way that it fits into your memory practice. And interestingly, some of the original Incunabula, some of the first books published, were actually books for field naturalists. So that second form of memory that Comte pushes us towards is this rational reconstruction, this other way of forming the past without having to remember all the messiness that went in there along the way. And I'll unpack some difficulties with that a little bit as we go on. Final problem, I think this is the final problem with this set of memories of the past, is they're really dependent on the infrastructure you're using. They're really dependent on the machines that you have. That it's very easy to say, okay, we're going to create this eternal flame site. Memory is cheap. Now I can remember everything. But it all depends on what operating system you're doing and what version of what program. Here's an example of many old computers in one room. If you actually go to many of the big banks today, you'll find they've got these warehouses which run all the operating systems on all the machines that they've had over the last 20 to 30 years because they don't know where different programs come from. They're still running a lot of stuff on COBOL 80, which was kind of a huge and lunky program, which I actually learned in the mid-80s. But they need to be running that still. That still needs to be there. So at the same time as quote-unquote memory is cheap, actually the maintenance of all of these different machines and the maintenance of all these different programs is a huge problem. Additional problem on that, just a quick technical note, is what's called incremental metadata. Incremental metadata is you move data from one medium to another. Each time you move it from one medium to another, you need to add some information about provenance. You need to add some more metadata. That in itself is expensive. So memory is not really cheap by any means in the world today. It's probably more expensive than it's ever been. Time. I'm now going to go on a little bit about the virtues and nature of forgetting in the world today, because we seem to think that we're remembering everything and that we should remember everything, but we're not. We really are doing some pretty good regimes of forgetting right now. Give you a bit of a background on this. C. McKean, 2nd century BC, one of the great historiographers, talks about the first emperor. Approving his proposal, the first emperor collected up and got rid of the songs, the documents, and the saying of the 100 schools, in order to make the people stupid and ensure that in all under heaven there should be no rejection of the present by using the past. The clarification of laws and regulations and the settling of statutes and ordinances all started with the first emperor. He standardized documents. Now, actually, I do have a lot to say about the role of standardization in inaugurating new regimes of forgetting. I won't go into huge detail about that right now. I just want to pull out this point, that act of standardization, that act of, from this moment on, this is the way in which records will be kept, that in and of itself creates a vacuum in the past. It's very difficult to get back beyond that point of standardization, because all your search tools and all your search techniques will only take you back up to the point of inauguration. They will not take you behind that. Acts of oblivion have occurred at various points in human history. This is the act of oblivion during the English Revolution. King Charles said he well knows that a general act of oblivion is the best bond of peace. And then the levelers who are fighting King Charles and the royalists respond, the things and worthy acts which have been done and achieved by this army and their adherents in defence of the just authority of this honourable house, being so far from meriting an odious act of oblivion, they rather deserve a most honourable act of perpetual remembrance. And in fact, after the English Revolution, an act of oblivion was passed. After the Athenian Civil War in 403 BC, there was also an act of oblivion passed, not under that name, but it was an act of, we shall not talk about, we shall not refer to this past event. Now, actually, that's a highly effective thing. In individual psychology, you tell someone to forget something, there's a very good chance they'll forget it. Just immediately you've said something really dumb, say, forget I ever said that. There's a good chance they will. Similarly with acts of oblivion, they do work. And we're getting very good right now at producing acts of oblivion. Here's a more modern day one, which I'm actually more in favour of. This was a public book burning of The Road Ahead by Bill Gates. Forgetting is big business. Here's various forms of forgetting which are going on right now. There's an industrial shredder, top left. There's a shredder of computing equipment there, of computer disks, God, I've not seen a floppy for a while, so I guess that's a little bit old. There's an Araza data destroyer and a 2-in-1 hand shredder, which will shred various kinds of paper for you. You've also got programs. Data destroyer, section 9, purging files. I mean, the language is wonderful. Purge the Slack area. OK to purge read-only files. Yes, purge this files. No, cancel this purge. Very strong language. What's happening here is that, actually this is repeating a little bit, I'm sorry for the fellows, some stuff we talked about over lunch, but what's happening here is that there was a golden period in email communication when people basically wrote what they were thinking and they just wrote their thoughts out. Now increasingly people are aware that they're writing for the public record. Your emails can be subpoenaed, your computer records can be subpoenaed, so when you create an archive, when you create a record, you're creating it for its legal setting, for posterity, for what other folks are going to make of it afterwards. I saw a really stark case of this when I was doing my initial study several years ago of the information practices at Schlumberger, which is a geophysical prospecting company. Up until the mid-1930s, they said everything that they were doing. They told us how they cheated on patents, how they cobbled together results and put them forward as scientific results when they really weren't. I mean, all kinds of really good information was out there. They then came up against a patent infringement suit against Halliburton, and I wish they did win, but Halliburton unfortunately survived. Their record keeping just changed entirely. Overnight, it went from being in French and complete records to in English and very, very formal, very narrow record keeping. So what we're doing right now is we're creating these pasts not out of whole cloth, not out of everything that's occurring. We're creating a past with a view to the future reader and with a view to the future context of readership. Are there other forms of memory? Let me move into that for a few minutes. So, have I done enough on that? Yes, I have. Okay, yes, I think there are, and I think we should be thinking about other ways of remembering the past and other kinds of access into the past that should and could be available through the internet and internet-based technologies. This is a traditional one which I really love because it's sort of so surprising. It's one of the first handheld memory devices. It's from the Luba. It's a tribe in West Africa in the Congo region. It's from a wonderful book called The Memory of the Luba. And this handheld device holds the topography of the tribal area. It holds the clans in the area, the totemic splits, the chiefs over the last, I think it's 7 or 8 generations are listed in there. It's got a whole series of different information forms conflated onto a single kind of tablet form. This kind of visual memory we don't really think very much about, and I'd really like to explore new ways of doing that. I've always found yantras, for example, Tibetan yantras are really interesting that way. They're these pictures that implode together with astronomical information, geographic information, architectural information, all within a single space. But we don't think about complex forms of visual memory. What don't we remember? Well, we certainly don't remember the things that the Tale of Genji tells us about. Tale of Genji is a 12th century Japanese novel, absolutely gorgeous novel. What it does, it's extremely beautiful about texture, time, moments, the rustle of silk, the smell of something. All of these intangibles that are not fitted, that don't fit into event form, that don't fit into this single linear time, that don't fit into sort of the daily blogs of what's happening in the world, the events, all of those different kinds of experience of the world, those tend to get written out of our culture, written out of the memory practices that we have. And I don't see that we have today anything that's as good as that old form of memory keeping in the Tale of Genji. Somewhat more complex example, perhaps. I don't know if any of you will recognize this. This is the Ise Shrine in Japan. It's been argued that the Ise Shrine is one of the oldest buildings in the world. It doesn't look like it. Actually, it gets rebuilt every 20 years. It's in its 61st rebuilding now. The 62nd rebuilding will take place in the year 2013. It's rebuilt every 20 years using exactly the same techniques, exactly the same craft as was used in the past. And here's the, what happens is they build the new shrine just next to the old shrine, and then tear down the old shrine, leaving just a 7-foot post in the middle, sacred post. So that this is in a transitional moment. That'll be, the upper one is about to be torn down, strewn with white pebbles. This one becomes a shrine, then in 20 years later they swap back. What's being preserved there is very different from the kinds of memory that we think about. We're used to memory in terms of, the events, the people, the actual physical building. We're not used to memory in terms of the craft, the skills, what went along with this, what was the, techniques that really held this together. So we have a very good memory, in a sense, of Chartres Cathedral because we've preserved the building very well. We have almost no memory of how Chartres was built. And actually it's a huge problem today. I've got a friend who works at NASA, Charlotte Lindy, who's come up with this beautiful thing about the Memory of the Moon project. That Bush has downscaled the mission to Mars with a mission to the moon. And basically they don't know how to get to the moon anymore. There are specs, there are records to some extent of what was done. But there were a lot of decisions that were taken on the fly, that were taken in committee, that were taken, okay, we need to adjust this need against that need. We need to reconcile these, your space needs with your space needs for the booster, with this space needs for the astronaut, and so on and so forth. All of those on-the-fly decisions have been lost. And those skills are no longer there. And they're actually, as they do the Mission to Mars project, they're actually looking at creating new kinds of organizational memory that would allow them to retain this sort of thing, as well as the actual physical object. Finally, on the physical object keeping, it sort of relates to the past. There's a, oh no, sorry, too late. I'll go into it some later, perhaps. Finally, on other forms of remembering, sorry, this is just finishing up this theme of what do we preserve and what do we destroy in order to create new memories. Here's a mural in Venice and in northern Italy. And if you go through northern Italy, you'll often see these wall murals, and they're absolutely gorgeous, preserved from 16th, 17th centuries. By allowing yourself to keep and preserve those, you're preventing yourself from producing new kinds of murals in the present. There really is something of an either-or there. You can't, in order to create new and interesting presents and new and interesting links into the past, you have to be operating some kind of regimes of forgetting and regimes of destruction, painful as that may be. And this is a more modern mural. It's actually John Pugh. This is in LA. And this is an actual drain pipe coming out of the Trompe-l'œil, and it represents you folks stealing our water from Northern California. Finally, slow memory. This is indicative of slow memory, but I'm going to talk more analogically about it in a minute. This is one of the first memory devices in computers, the Williams tube. It was actually mercury delay memory device. What they do is they have a piezo crystal at one end which would spark. That would send a pulse down the memory tube, down the mercury tube very slowly. It would be converted to a piezoelectric charge at the other end, come back to the other end, and then keep cycling. So you had a very, very slow memory device going on there. So what is slow memory, and why should we have more of it? Well, there are three ways in which we can think about this. First of all, there are the accidental, if you like, continuities between infrastructures, which we don't really pay attention to and understand enough, I think. Some of these are fairly obvious. The QWERTY keyboard is one, accidental hangover from the days of the manual typewriter. 80 columns on the computer screen, hangover from punch cards. And there's the urban legend of the Polaris missile being the size of the horse's ass, which I can go into if you like. More significantly, we have hangovers from the old infrastructure in terms of files and folders, in terms of the single linear representation of time that we deal with in our organization of knowledge on the internet. No reason to do that. There are many different ways in which we could organize our time, but we have a huge hangover there. Third reason for looking at slow memory and slow change is that we're blocked out of understanding ourselves as part of, say, the encyclopedic work of the late 18th century. We're blocked out of our connections with governmentality. We're blocked out of the real continuities that we have with late 18th century culture and through the 19th century with our belief that somehow the present is radically different because it's subtended by a different information technology. The continuities between the information technology now and then are far greater than the discontinuities. And by paying attention always to the discontinuities, we prevent useful discourse between disciplines. For example, library scientists don't talk to information scientists, even though library scientists have been playing in much of the same ground for the last 200 years. Case in point here, many of you will know Delicious and the tagging, and Clay Shirky's comment that Clay Shirky's claim that right now we no longer need to have classification systems. They're all dead. We can have folksonomies with everyone producing their own tags. Now, in fact, well, all right. Well, in fact, yeah, let me just come out with a McCarthyite assertion. In fact, this doesn't work. But in fact, also, it ties in with a very long tradition in library science, going back to Ranganathan in the 1920s, 1930s, who was a great library scientist who came up with faceted classifications. Faceted classifications, he based his around personality, matter, energy, space, and time. So instead of predetermining your ontology, what you did in this case was you defined various facets of an object, and you could get access through the facets. Facets in simple form on the web today, facets shot by materials, shot special occasions, shot by type. So you've got multiple points of entry into a single database. That's how faceted classifications work. It's largely what the tags would help us to produce. There is a real continuity, an interesting continuity there between communities that really haven't talked to each other. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm actually not going to go through these slides in detail. They're about identity, and I can, on question, talk about identity and the importance of identity. But for right now, I'm just going to do a few pretty pictures before I finish. These are various kinds of moth. Insect. There's an insect pretending to be a leaf. There's one pretending to be a twig. There's one pretending to be lichen. And there's one pretending to be a snake. And I can, on question, say, well, I thought that was interesting in the context of this talk. So finishing off quickly, going back to the original quote on the different eras, I've stressed here that there are different, in a sense, yes, there are different eras. We need to understand the eras very differently. But I've also stressed that we need to understand the great continuities that there are, and we should be looking at continuity as much as at discontinuity. On the multiple lines into the past, I think this is one of the most important things. We don't have multiple lines into the past right now. We could easily create them. One example I'll go into very quickly, AIDS. Generally, people say AIDS was invented in 1986, 1987, when the virus was, when the HIV virus was first isolated. There's very good evidence that it actually goes back much further in time. There's one argument that Erasmus had AIDS. There's certainly very good evidence that a Norwegian family in 1957 died of AIDS. A Norwegian sailor goes to Kenya, comes back, infects his family, whole family dies. End of story. That is irretrievable. That kind of information is irretrievable from the medical records right now because there is a final decision made on the classification at too early a point in the process. Instead of using a faceted classification or any of the flexible ontologies, medical record keeping still largely says what was the cause of death, what were the contributory causes, you name that according to your current ontology, you lose all the other information. And that means that as new disease entities come into being, as they surely will, and as new entities in general come into being in the world, instead of having access to ways of reconfiguring the past, we lock ourselves into single unitary visions of the past totally unnecessarily. Final point, I was delighted. This is actually the origin of the river Ganges. It ties in with the Pynchon quote. And it's also based on a wonderful passage by Michel Serres in The Origins of Geometry, which he says, if you go back to the origin of a river, and this is the origin of the Ganges or the origin of another river up there. If you go back to the origin of a river, it's kind of like from the moment the river starts, then there seems to be an arrow to time. The river flows downhill. This is the source. From this point on, it goes clear and simple in one direction. You've got an arrow at a time. You've got a very simple description of what the river is. Behind the river, though, behind the source, there are myriad capillaries that feed into the source. T.S. Eliot puts it beautifully in the last stanza of the Four Quartets, as that behind every source there is a waterfall. There is a huge waterfall, and it's precisely that point that. At the point of origin, we're at the point with the internet where we're creating this point of origin right now. And as we create this point of origin, ontologies now in the world. And I think that's a pity, and I think we can really make some progress in changing that. So thank you.